The whiskey-soaked laughter from the saloon across the street had long stopped bothering Wilhelmina Louise, but tonight it felt like mockery aimed directly at her heart. She stood at the window of her father's dry goods store in Enid, Oklahoma, watching another group of men stumble out into the dusty street, and she knew with absolute certainty that not one of them would ever look at her the way a man should look at the woman he wanted to marry. It was the spring of 1893, and at 23 years old, Wilhelmina had become something of a town curiosity, the shopkeeper's daughter who had turned away or been turned away by every eligible man within 50 miles. Her father, Gerald Louise, wiped down the counter behind her, the familiar sound of his cloth against wood a comfort in the gathering darkness. He was a kind man, weathered by years of frontier life, but still possessed of a gentle spirit that had drawn her mother to him all those years ago. Her mother had died when Wilhelmina was only 7, taken by fever one brutal winter, and since then it had been just the two of them running the store, making a decent living, surviving. "You should go on up to bed, Willie," her father said softly, using the nickname only he was allowed to use. "No point standing there watching the darkness." She turned to him, managing a small smile. "I was just thinking about the Anderson boys' proposal last week." Her father's face creased with concern. "That boy is a fool. You were right to turn him down." "He is the 7th man this year to ask for my hand," Wilhelmina said, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "And the 7th I have refused." "Because not one of them saw you," her father replied, setting down his cloth and coming to stand beside her. "They see this store. They see a woman who can cook and clean and keep books, but they do not see Wilhelmina Louise, who reads poetry by lamplight and can calculate figures faster than any man in 3 counties, who has a laugh that sounds like wind chimes and a heart big enough to love fiercely if only someone deserved it." Wilhelmina felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them away. She had cried enough over the years, over the men who had looked through her rather than at her, over the whispers that followed her through town about how particular she was, how prideful, how she would end up a spinster if she did not lower her standards. But lowering her standards had never been the problem. The problem was that not one of those men had made her feel anything beyond polite tolerance. "Maybe I am too particular," she said quietly. "Or maybe the right man has not found his way here yet," her father countered. "Your mother, God rest her soul, she told me once that she had waited 25 years for me to walk into her father's shop in Missouri. 25 years, Willie. And when I did, she said she knew within 5 minutes that I was the one she had been waiting for." Wilhelmina had heard this story before, but it never failed to bring her comfort. How did she know? "She said it felt like coming home after a long journey," her father replied, his eyes distant with memory. "Like everything suddenly made sense in a way it never had before." That night, Wilhelmina lay in her small room above the store, listening to the sounds of Enid settling into sleep around her. Dogs barked in the distance. A wagon rattled past. Someone played a harmonica badly. She thought about all the men who had courted her over the years, trying to remember if any of them had made her feel even a fraction of what her father described. There had been Thomas Wright, the banker's son, who had proposed when she was 19. He had nice enough manners and a secure future, but he had also made it clear that once they married, she would give up helping in the store and focus entirely on making his home comfortable. When she had suggested she might continue with the bookkeeping, he had laughed as if she had made a joke. Then came Samuel Peterson, a rancher from the next town over. He was handsome in a rough way, but he had spent their entire courtship talking about himself, his cattle, his plans, his dreams. When she had tried to share her own thoughts about expanding the store's inventory, he had patted her hand and told her not to worry her pretty head about business matters. After Samuel came a parade of others, each rejection adding to her reputation as the woman who could not be pleased. But it was not about being pleased, Wilhelmina thought as she finally drifted toward sleep. It was about being seen. It was about finding someone who looked at her and recognized something essential, something true, something worth knowing beyond her ability to manage a household or produce children. The next morning dawned hot and clear, the kind of day that promised to bake the streets of Enid into hardened clay by noon. Wilhelmina rose early, as she always did, and helped her father prepare the store for opening. They stocked shelves, swept floors, and reviewed the orders that needed to be placed with suppliers in larger towns. It was familiar work, comfortable work, and Wilhelmina threw herself into it with the efficiency born of years of practice. The morning customers came and went, familiar faces with familiar needs. Mrs. Henderson needed fabric for a new dress. Mr. Carlyle wanted ammunition for hunting. Young Mary Sutton came in for penny candy with coins clutched in her small fist. Wilhelmina served them all with courtesy and competence, and if she noticed the pitying glances some of the women gave her, she pretended not to. It was just past noon when everything changed. Wilhelmina was in the back room, checking inventory against her carefully maintained lists, when she heard the bell above the front door chime. She heard her father greet someone, heard the low rumble of a male voice she did not recognize, heard her father laugh in a way he rarely did with strangers. Curious, she set down her pencil and stepped through the curtain that separated the store from the back room. The man standing at the counter was a stranger, but something about him made Wilhelmina stop in her tracks. He was tall, with broad shoulders that spoke of hard work and a lean frame that suggested he spent more time in the saddle than out of it. His hair was dark, touched with dust from the road, and his face was tanned from long hours in the sun. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, clear and gray and focused entirely on whatever her father was showing him behind the counter. "Ah, Willie, come meet our guest," her father called out, spotting her. "This is Yates Crawford, just rode in from Guthrie Way. He is looking for some supplies." Yates Crawford turned, and when his gray eyes met hers, Wilhelmina felt something shift in her chest, like a door opening in a room she had not known was locked. He smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "Pleased to make your acquaintance." "Mr. Crawford," Wilhelmina managed, acutely aware that her father was watching them both with undisguised interest. "Welcome to Enid. What brings you to our town?" Something flickered across Yates's face, an expression Wilhelmina could not quite read. He glanced at her father, then back at her, and she had the strangest sense that he was weighing his words carefully. "Business, mostly," he said after a moment. "And a bit of curiosity, if I am being honest." "Curiosity about Enid?" Wilhelmina asked, moving closer to the counter. "We are not exactly the most exciting town in Oklahoma Territory. Sometimes the most interesting things are found in unexpected places," Yates replied, and there was something in the way he said it, in the way he was looking at her, that made Wilhelmina's heart beat faster. Her father cleared his throat, and Wilhelmina realized she had been staring. She felt heat rise to her cheeks and busied herself straightening items on the counter that did not need straightening. "Mr. Crawford needs rope, dried beef, and ammunition," her father said, his tone amused. "Willie, could you help him with those items while I finish tallying Mrs. Henderson's order?" "Of course," Wilhelmina said, grateful for something to do with her hands. She led Yates to the appropriate shelves, acutely aware of his presence beside her. He was not standing too close, was perfectly respectful in his distance, but she could feel the heat of him in the warm air of the store. "How much rope do you need?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain steady and professional. "About 50 feet should do," Yates replied. "I am setting up a temporary camp outside town. Need to secure my tent and gear." "You are not staying at the boarding house." The question was out before Wilhelmina could stop it, and she immediately regretted it. What business was it of hers where this stranger chose to stay? But Yates did not seem to mind. "I prefer the open air when I can get it," he said. "Spent too many years sleeping under the stars to feel comfortable with a roof over my head unless the weather turns bad." Wilhelmina measured out the rope, her fingers working automatically while her mind raced. There was something about this man that drew her, something beyond his obvious physical appeal. He had a quietness about him, a sense of contained strength that was different from the blustering confidence of the men she had known. "What kind of business brings you to Enid?" she asked as she moved to the dried beef, selecting the best pieces from their stock. "Horse trading, primarily," Yates said. "I heard there were some ranchers in this area looking for good breeding stock, and I have connections with some excellent breeders up in Kansas. Thought I would come down and see if I could broker some deals." "That seems like quite a journey for business you are not certain of," Wilhelmina observed, wrapping the beef in brown paper. Yates smiled again, and Wilhelmina felt her stomach flip. "Well, like I said, I was curious. And sometimes you have to take a chance on things, even when you are not certain of the outcome." The way he said it, the way he was looking at her, made Wilhelmina wonder if he was talking about more than just horse trading. But that was ridiculous, she told herself firmly. He was a stranger who had just arrived in town. He could not possibly be interested in her, not when he did not even know her. She gathered the ammunition he needed, packed everything carefully, and returned to the front counter where her father was finishing with Mrs. Henderson. The older woman gave Yates a curious look as she left, and Wilhelmina knew that by sunset, the entire town would know a handsome stranger had arrived. Her father tallied up Yates's purchases, and the cowboy paid without complaint, his worn leather wallet suggesting he was a man of modest means but not destitute. He gathered his supplies, tipped his hat to both of them, and headed for the door. But just before he left, he turned back, his gray eyes finding Wilhelmina's across the store. "Would it be acceptable if I came back tomorrow?" he asked. "I am sure I will think of other supplies I need, and it is clear you run the finest store in town." "It is the only general store in town," Wilhelmina said, trying to keep her voice light despite the way her heart was hammering. "Then I am lucky I do not have to choose between inferior options," Yates replied, and with another tip of his hat, he was gone. The silence that followed his departure seemed to ring in Wilhelmina's ears. She stood frozen at the counter, staring at the door, trying to understand what had just happened. "Well," her father said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "That was interesting." "He is just a customer," Wilhelmina said, but even to her own ears, the words sounded unconvincing. "Of course," her father agreed far too readily. "Just a customer who rode all the way from Guthrie on business he is not certain of and who seems very interested in returning to our humble store." Wilhelmina turned to her father, ready to argue, but stopped when she saw the expression on his face. He looked hopeful, more hopeful than she had seen him in years, and she did not have the heart to crush that hope with her own doubts. "Do not start planning a wedding," she said instead, trying to make it sound like a joke. "He will probably be gone by the end of the week." But even as she said it, she did not quite believe it. There had been something in Yates Crawford's eyes, something that suggested he was a man who knew what he wanted and was not afraid to pursue it. That night, lying in bed once again, Wilhelmina found her thoughts returning again and again to the stranger with the gray eyes. She told herself she was being foolish, that she had learned long ago not to get her hopes up about men. But there had been something different about Yates Crawford, something that made her want to believe, just for a moment, that perhaps her father was right. Perhaps the right man had finally found his way to Enid. The next day dragged interminably. Wilhelmina found herself watching the door, jumping slightly every time the bell chimed, only to feel disappointment when it was not Yates. Her father noticed, of course, but he had the grace not to comment, though she caught him smiling to himself more than once. It was late afternoon when Yates finally returned. Wilhelmina was helping old Mr. Garrett select tobacco when the bell chimed, and she looked up to see the cowboy stepping through the door, his hat in his hands and a slightly uncertain expression on his face. "Mr. Crawford," she said, pleased that her voice came out steady. "What can we help you with today?" "I need some coffee," Yates said, moving toward the counter. "And maybe some sugar if you have it." "We do," Wilhelmina assured him, excusing herself from Mr. Garrett and moving to gather the requested items. "How much do you need?" "Enough for a few weeks," Yates replied. "I am thinking I might stay in the area longer than I originally planned." Wilhelmina's hands stilled for just a moment before she forced them to continue working. "Did you find the business opportunities you were hoping for?" "Some," Yates said. "But I also found something I was not expecting, and I would like the chance to explore it further." The way he said it, the way he was looking at her, made it clear he was not talking about horses. Wilhelmina felt heat rise to her face again, but she did not look away from his steady gaze. "Miss Louise," Yates said, his voice quieter now, meant for her ears only. "I hope I am not being too forward, but would you allow me to call on you? Properly, I mean. With your father's permission, of course." Wilhelmina's breath caught in her throat. This was not how courtship usually worked in her experience. Men typically circled for weeks or months, making their intentions known gradually, building up to the request. But Yates Crawford seemed to be a man who knew what he wanted and was not interested in wasting time. "You do not even know me," she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. "I would like to," Yates replied simply, "if you will give me the chance." Before Wilhelmina could respond, her father appeared from the back room, his timing either incredibly fortunate or incredibly deliberate. He took in the scene, Wilhelmina standing frozen with coffee in her hands, Yates watching her with patient hope, and his face broke into a wide smile. "Mr. Crawford," he said warmly, "I could not help but overhear. You have my permission to call on my daughter, provided she is agreeable to the idea." All eyes turned to Wilhelmina. She looked at Yates, at this stranger who had ridden into town just yesterday and was now asking to court her, and she thought about her mother's words that her father had shared. It felt like coming home after a long journey. Like everything suddenly made sense in a way it never had before. She did not feel that yet, not exactly. But she felt something. A pull toward this man that was stronger than anything she had felt before, a curiosity that went beyond simple attraction. And after years of feeling nothing, that seemed like a good enough reason to take a chance. "I am agreeable," she said softly, and the smile that spread across Yates's face was worth every moment of uncertainty. They agreed that Yates would return the following evening to take Wilhelmina for a walk, properly chaperoned by her father at a discreet distance, of course. It was all very traditional and respectable, but Wilhelmina found her heart racing with excitement as she watched Yates leave the store, his purchases forgotten until her father laughingly reminded him. The news of Yates Crawford's courtship of Wilhelmina Louise spread through Enid faster than a prairie fire. By the next morning, every person who came into the store had something to say about it. The women were divided between those who were happy for Wilhelmina and those who were deeply suspicious of this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere. The men were uniformly skeptical, particularly those who had courted Wilhelmina themselves. Thomas Wright came into the store that afternoon, his face set in disapproving lines. "Willie," he said, ignoring the fact that only her father was allowed to use that nickname. "I heard about this Crawford fellow. You do not know anything about him. He could be anyone, could have any sort of past." "I do not know much about him yet," Wilhelmina agreed calmly. "That is why courtship exists, Thomas, to learn about one another." "But you refused me," Thomas said, his voice rising slightly. "You refused all of us. What makes this stranger so different?" Wilhelmina considered the question carefully. "I suppose he makes me want to know more about him," she said finally. "And that is something I never felt before." Thomas left in a huff, and Wilhelmina tried not to feel satisfaction at his obvious displeasure. She knew she was being talked about, knew that people were placing bets on how long Yates would stay before moving on, but for once, she did not care. She was tired of living her life according to the expectations and judgments of others. That evening, Yates arrived precisely on time, dressed in clean clothes and with his hair freshly combed. He greeted her father with respect, offered his arm to Wilhelmina with a smile, and led her out into the warm Oklahoma evening. Her father followed at a distance, far enough to give them privacy but close enough to satisfy propriety. Wilhelmina was grateful for his understanding. Many fathers would have hovered, would have inserted themselves into the conversation, but Gerald Louise seemed content to let his daughter discover this man on her own terms. They walked through the streets of Enid, past the saloon and the boarding house, past the church and the schoolhouse, toward the open prairie that stretched beyond the town's boundaries. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and Wilhelmina thought she had never seen anything more beautiful. "Tell me about yourself," Yates said as they walked, his voice gentle. "What do you want out of life, Wilhelmina Louise?" No one had ever asked her that before. They had asked what kind of wife she would be, what kind of home she would keep, how many children she wanted, but no one had ever asked what she wanted for herself. "I want to matter," she said after a long moment. "I want to do something that makes a difference, even if it is just a small difference. I want to be seen for who I truly am, not just for what I can provide. And I want to love someone who loves me back with equal measure." Yates nodded thoughtfully. "Those seem like reasonable wants." "What makes you think you cannot have them?" "Every man I have ever met has wanted me to fit into a particular shape," Wilhelmina said honestly. "They wanted a wife who would fade into the background, who would support their dreams without having any of her own. And when I could not be that person, they moved on to someone who could." "Then they were fools," Yates said bluntly. "A woman with her own dreams, her own mind, her own fire, that is worth 100 women who just agree with everything a man says." Wilhelmina looked up at him, surprised by the vehemence in his voice. "You sound like you speak from experience." "My mother," Yates said with a small smile. "She was a force of nature, had her own opinions on everything and was not afraid to share them. My father adored her for it. He used to say that life with her was never boring, and that was exactly what he wanted." "What happened to them?" Wilhelmina asked softly. "Cholera took them both when I was 16, Yates said, his voice heavy with old grief. "It swept through our town in Kansas, took half the population in a matter of weeks. I survived, but they did not." "I am so sorry," Wilhelmina said, and she meant it. She knew the pain of losing a mother, and she could not imagine losing her father as well. "It was a long time ago," Yates said. "But it taught me something important. Life is short, and the time we have with the people we love is precious. I do not believe in wasting that time pretending to be something you are not, or settling for less than what your heart truly wants." They had reached the edge of town now, where the buildings gave way to open grassland. Yates stopped and turned to face Wilhelmina, his gray eyes serious in the fading light. "I need to tell you something," he said. "I need to be honest with you from the start, because I do not believe in beginning any relationship with deception." Wilhelmina's heart began to beat faster. "What is it?" "I did not come to Enid just for horse trading," Yates said. "I came because I heard about you." The words hung in the air between them, and Wilhelmina stared at him in confusion. "You heard about me? What do you mean?" Yates ran a hand through his hair, looking slightly uncomfortable. "About 2 months ago, I was in Guthrie, having a drink with some other cowboys. One of them, a fellow named Jake Matthews, started talking about a town called Enid. He said there was a woman there, the prettiest woman in 3 counties, who had turned down every man who had ever asked for her hand. He was laughing about it, calling you prideful and saying you would die a spinster because no man would ever be good enough for you." Wilhelmina felt her chest tighten with old hurt. She remembered Jake Matthews. He had courted her briefly last year, and when she had refused his proposal, he had turned nasty, spreading rumors about her around town. "I am sorry you heard that," she said stiffly, preparing to pull away. But Yates reached out and gently caught her hand, his touch warm and careful. "Wait, let me finish. When Jake said those things, I got angry. I did not even know you, but I got angry on your behalf. Because the way he talked about you, it was not the way a man should talk about a woman he claimed to have cared for. And I started thinking about what kind of woman would turn down every proposal, what kind of strength and self-knowledge that would take." Wilhelmina looked down at their joined hands, then up at his face. "So you came all the way here because of saloon gossip?" "I came because I wanted to meet the woman who knew her own worth well enough not to settle," Yates said. "And I wanted to see if maybe, just maybe, I could be the kind of man who would be worthy of her." Wilhelmina felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of recognition, of something shifting into place in her heart. "That is the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard," she said, her voice shaking. "You rode all this way based on nothing but a story told by a bitter man in a saloon." "I know," Yates said, and he was smiling now, that slow smile that transformed his whole face. "My friends told me I was crazy, but I could not shake the feeling that I needed to come here, needed to meet you. And now that I have, I am very glad I listened to that feeling." Behind them, discreetly distant, her father cleared his throat. The sun had set fully now, and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. It was time to head back. As they walked back toward town, Wilhelmina's hand still in Yates's, she felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of tension she had been carrying for years. This man had ridden all the way from another county just for the chance to meet her. Not because of her father's store, not because of her ability to keep house, but because he had heard she was a woman who knew her own mind, and that had intrigued him. It was the most romantic thing Wilhelmina had ever heard, and the most terrifying. Because it meant that this was real, or at least had the potential to be real. And if it was real, if she let herself hope and it failed, the disappointment would be crushing. But as they reached the store and Yates said goodnight with a promise to return the next day, Wilhelmina thought about her father's words. Sometimes you have to take a chance on things, even when you are not certain of the outcome. She had spent years protecting her heart, years refusing to settle. Maybe now it was time to take a risk on something that felt right, even if it was scary. Over the next few weeks, Yates became a regular presence in Wilhelmina's life. He came to the store every day, sometimes to purchase supplies, sometimes just to talk. He took her on walks in the evening, always properly chaperoned, and they talked about everything from philosophy to farming, from dreams to disappointments. Wilhelmina learned that Yates was 26 years old, that he had spent the years since his parents' death working various jobs across Kansas and Oklahoma territory, saving his money and learning about horses. He was good with animals, had a natural instinct for understanding them, and his dream was to one day own his own ranch where he could breed quality horses. Yates learned that Wilhelmina was not just smart with numbers but genuinely loved the work of running the store, that she read everything she could get her hands on, that she had ideas for expanding the business that her father had never had the capital or courage to pursue. He learned that she was kind but not soft, that she could be stubborn when she believed in something, and that beneath her proper exterior was a woman who longed for adventure and meaning. The town watched their courtship with varying degrees of approval and skepticism. Some people, particularly the older women who remembered romantic love, were charmed by the story of the cowboy who had ridden from another county just to meet Wilhelmina. Others, particularly the men she had rejected, were resentful and waiting for Yates to prove himself unworthy. Thomas Wright was particularly vocal in his disapproval. He cornered Yates one afternoon outside the saloon, his friends flanking him in a show of intimidation that might have worked on a lesser man. "What are your intentions toward Willie?" Thomas demanded, his voice loud enough to attract attention from passers-by. Yates regarded him calmly. "My intentions are to court her honorably, and if she will have me, to marry her and spend the rest of my life making her happy." "You expect us to believe that?" one of Thomas's friends scoffed. "A drifter cowboy with no property and no prospects. You are probably after her father's store." "I have prospects," Yates said, his voice still calm but with an edge of steel. "I have money saved and skills that will earn me more, and I do not need her father's store. What I want is Wilhelmina herself, which is apparently something none of you could understand." Thomas stepped closer, his face red with anger. "You do not know her like we do. She is impossible to please. She will reject you just like she rejected all of us." "Maybe," Yates agreed. "That is her right. But the difference between you and me is that I actually hope she will choose someone worthy of her, even if it is not me. You just want her to lower her standards enough to choose you, which is not the same thing at all." The crowd that had gathered murmured at this, and Wilhelmina, who had heard the commotion and come to investigate, felt her heart swell with something warm and bright. Yates had defended not just her, but her right to choose, her right to have standards. He had not tried to claim ownership of her or insist that she would definitely accept him. He had simply stated his intentions and respected her autonomy. Thomas looked like he wanted to start a physical fight, but his friends pulled him back, perhaps sensing that they would not come out of this confrontation looking good. The crowd dispersed, and Wilhelmina approached Yates, who looked slightly embarrassed. "I am sorry," he said immediately. "I did not mean to cause a scene." "You did not cause it," Wilhelmina replied. "Thomas did, and thank you for what you said, for understanding that my choices are my own." "Of course they are," Yates said, looking genuinely confused that this needed to be stated. "Why would I want to be with someone who did not actively choose to be with me? Where is the joy in that?" Wilhelmina looked at this man, this wonderful, understanding man who had somehow appeared in her life, and she felt her heart open in a way it never had before. She was falling in love with Yates Crawford, she realized. Not the gradual tolerance that she had felt for other suitors, not the polite affection that could maybe grow into something more. This was the real thing, the feeling her mother had described, the sensation of coming home after a long journey. "Yates," she said softly, and something in her voice made him look at her more closely. "I need to tell you something." "Anything," he said immediately. "I am falling in love with you," Wilhelmina said, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess them. "I know it has only been a few weeks, and I know that is probably too fast, but I have never felt like this before, and I needed you to know." For a moment, Yates just stared at her, his gray eyes wide with surprise. Then his face broke into the brightest smile Wilhelmina had ever seen, and he laughed, a joyous sound that made her laugh too. "Too fast," he said, shaking his head. "Wilhelmina, I knew I was falling in love with you the first day I walked into your father's store. I just did not want to scare you away by saying it." "You love me?" Wilhelmina asked, needing to hear it clearly. "I love you," Yates confirmed, and then, mindful of the fact that they were standing in the middle of the street, he took her hand and led her to a more private spot between two buildings. "I love your intelligence and your strength and your refusal to settle for less than you deserve. I love the way you light up when you talk about books or numbers or your ideas for the store. I love that you see people clearly, both their good and their bad. I love everything about you, Wilhelmina Louise, and I would be the happiest man alive if you would agree to marry me." Wilhelmina felt tears streaming down her face, but she did not care. "Yes," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you, Yates Crawford." Yates pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and Wilhelmina felt that sensation her mother had described, coming home. Everything making sense. This was right. This was real. This was what she had been waiting for all along. They were married 6 weeks later in the small church at the center of Enid. The whole town turned out for the wedding, some people genuinely happy for the couple, others just curious to see if Wilhelmina would actually go through with it. She wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved all these years, and carried wildflowers that Yates had gathered himself from the prairie. Her father walked her down the aisle with tears in his eyes, and when he placed her hand in Yates's, he whispered, "Take care of her, son. She is my whole world." "I will," Yates promised solemnly, "with my whole heart for the rest of my life." The ceremony was simple but beautiful. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Yates kissed Wilhelmina with such tenderness that several women in the congregation sighed audibly. Thomas Wright was not in attendance, but most of Wilhelmina's other former suitors were, and she hoped they saw what a real partnership looked like. The reception was held in the yard behind the store, with tables of food contributed by various townspeople and music provided by a fiddle player from a neighboring farm. Wilhelmina danced with her new husband, with her father, with several townsmen who wanted to offer their congratulations. She was happier than she had ever been, and it showed in every smile, every laugh, every joyful moment. As the sun set and the party began to wind down, Yates took Wilhelmina's hand and led her away from the crowd. They had decided to spend their first night in the room above the store, the same room where Wilhelmina had grown up, before leaving the next day for a short honeymoon trip to Guthrie. Her father had made himself scarce, staying with a friend in town to give the newlyweds privacy. As Yates and Wilhelmina climbed the stairs to her room, Wilhelmina felt a flutter of nervousness. She had waited so long for this, had almost given up hope of ever finding someone to share her life with. Now that it was happening, it felt almost surreal. Yates seemed to sense her nervousness. He took both her hands in his and looked into her eyes with such love that Wilhelmina felt her anxiety melt away. "We do not have to do anything tonight except be together," he said gently. "There is no rush, no expectation. I just want you to feel safe and loved." "I do feel safe," Wilhelmina said truthfully. "And I do feel loved. And I love you, Yates Crawford, so very much." They came together then, tenderly and slowly, learning each other in the soft lamplight. Yates was gentle and patient, making sure Wilhelmina felt comfortable and cherished every moment. And when they finally lay together afterward, wrapped in each other's arms, Wilhelmina thought that this was what marriage was supposed to be. Not a transaction or a duty, but a joining of two people who chose each other freely and loved each other completely. The next morning they set out for Guthrie in a wagon Yates had purchased. The trip took most of the day, but Wilhelmina did not mind. She sat beside her husband, watching the prairie roll by, and felt more content than she ever had in her life. Guthrie was bigger than Enid, more established, with more stores and more people. Yates showed her around, introducing her to the friends he had made during his time there, including the group of cowboys who had been with him the night he heard about her. Jake Matthews was there, and when he saw Wilhelmina on Yates's arm, his face went pale. Yates introduced them politely, and Wilhelmina shook Jake's hand with cool courtesy. "I heard you two got married," Jake said awkwardly. "Congratulations." "Thank you," Wilhelmina said. "I hope you find someone who makes you as happy as Yates makes me." It was a gracious statement, more gracious than Jake probably deserved, but Wilhelmina was too happy to hold grudges. Jake had inadvertently brought Yates into her life, and for that, she could almost be grateful. They spent 3 days in Guthrie, staying in a small hotel and exploring the town. Yates showed Wilhelmina the ranch where he had worked, introduced her to the horses he had helped train. She could see how passionate he was about his work, how much he loved these animals, and she began to understand his dream of owning his own ranch more clearly. On their last night in Guthrie, as they lay in their hotel room, Wilhelmina broached a subject that had been on her mind. "Yates, what are your plans now that we are married? Where do you want to live? What do you want to do?" Yates was quiet for a moment, his hand stroking her hair gently. "I was thinking we would stay in Enid, at least for now. Your father needs help with the store, and it would not be right to take you away from him when he has no one else. But eventually, when we have saved enough money, I would like to buy some land and start that horse ranch I have always dreamed about." "What if we could do both?" Wilhelmina asked. "What if we expanded the store, used the profits to buy land, and built the ranch while still maintaining the business in town?" Yates sat up, looking at her with interest. "You have been thinking about this." "I have," Wilhelmina admitted. "The store does well, but it could do better. We could expand our inventory, maybe even open a second location in a larger town. With careful management and good planning, we could build enough capital to invest in your ranch within a few years." "Our ranch," Yates corrected gently. "If we do this, it will be ours together." "Your dreams matter just as much as mine, Wilhelmina." Wilhelmina felt tears prick at her eyes again. She seemed to cry a lot these days, but they were happy tears, tears of gratitude for this man who saw her as an equal partner. "What are your dreams?" Yates asked softly. "Besides the store, what do you want?" Wilhelmina thought about it. "I want a family," she said finally. "I want children who grow up knowing they are loved and valued for who they are, not what others expect them to be. I want a home filled with laughter and books and possibilities. And I want to build something meaningful with you, something that will last beyond our lifetimes." "Then that is what we will do," Yates said, pulling her close. "Together." They returned to Enid 3 days later, and life settled into a new rhythm. Wilhelmina and Yates moved into the room above the store, though they began making plans to build a small house on the outskirts of town. Yates helped Gerald in the store while also working with local ranchers on their horses, building a reputation as someone who understood equine behavior and could train even difficult animals. Wilhelmina took over more of the business side of the store, implementing some of her ideas for expansion. She negotiated better deals with suppliers, expanded their inventory to include items that were previously unavailable in Enid, and began researching the possibility of opening a second location. The town gradually accepted Yates as one of their own. His patience, his work ethic, and his obvious devotion to Wilhelmina won over even some of his harshest critics. The fact that he never tried to change her, never tried to diminish her role in the business, earned him respect from the women who had watched Wilhelmina struggle against expectations for years. 6 months after their wedding, Wilhelmina discovered she was pregnant. She told Yates one evening as they sat on the porch of the store, watching the sun set over the prairie. He was silent for a long moment, then pulled her into his arms and held her tight. "We are going to have a baby," he said, his voice full of wonder. "You and me, we are going to be parents." "Are you happy?" Wilhelmina asked, suddenly nervous. They had not specifically planned for a child so soon, though they had not prevented it either. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Yates said, pulling back to look at her face. "I am terrified and thrilled and so grateful I could burst." "A child, Wilhelmina, our child." They told her father the next day, and Gerald cried openly, something Wilhelmina had rarely seen him do. He hugged them both fiercely and immediately began making plans to help with the baby, to ensure that Wilhelmina could rest when she needed to make sure they had everything required for a new infant. The pregnancy was not easy. Wilhelmina was sick in the mornings for the first few months, and as she grew larger, working in the store became more difficult. But Yates was there every step of the way, taking on more of the physical work, making sure she ate properly, rubbing her aching back in the evenings. The baby was born on a cold February night in 1894, after a long and difficult labor. Wilhelmina thought she might die from the pain, but her father and Yates were there, and the midwife was calm and competent. When she finally heard the baby's cry, strong and healthy, she burst into tears of relief and joy. "It is a boy," the midwife announced, placing the tiny, red-faced infant in Wilhelmina's arms. "A fine, healthy boy." Yates looked down at his son with an expression of such pure love that Wilhelmina fell in love with him all over again. He reached out with one finger to touch the baby's tiny hand, and the infant immediately grasped it, holding on with surprising strength. "Hello, little one," Yates whispered. "I am your father, and I am going to love you and protect you for the rest of my life." They named him William Gerald Crawford, after Wilhelmina's mother, whose middle name had been William, and her father. Little William, or Will as they quickly began calling him, was a content baby who rarely cried and seemed to observe the world around him with solemn curiosity. Life with an infant was exhausting but joyful. Wilhelmina reduced her hours in the store, though she continued to handle the bookkeeping and planning from home. Yates split his time between the store, his horse training work, and helping with Will. Gerald was a devoted grandfather who spent every spare moment with his grandson. When Will was 6 months old, Yates came home one evening with news. A large ranch about 10 miles outside of Enid was selling off portions of its land, and Yates had been offered the opportunity to purchase a substantial parcel at a reasonable price. Between his savings and the profits from the store's expansion, they had enough to make the purchase. "It would be perfect for a horse ranch," Yates said, his eyes bright with excitement. "Good grazing land, access to water, close enough to town that we could still help with the store but far enough to have real space for the horses." "Then we should buy it," Wilhelmina said without hesitation. This is what we have been working toward." They finalized the purchase within a month, and Yates began the work of building their ranch. He started small, purchasing a few quality mares and a stallion, building corrals and a barn, slowly establishing the foundation of what would become a successful breeding operation. Meanwhile, Wilhelmina opened a second store location in a town about 20 miles from Enid. It was a risk, but one that paid off quickly. The new store did well from the start, and with careful management, it soon became as profitable as the original location. By the time Will was 2 years old, the Crawford family was splitting their time between a comfortable house on their ranch and helping Gerald with the stores. It was a busy life, but it was fulfilling in ways that Wilhelmina had never imagined possible. Then, in the summer of 1896, Wilhelmina discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, and when their second child was born in February of 1897, exactly 3 years after Will, it was a girl they named Margaret Louise Crawford, after both her grandmothers. Margaret was as different from Will as night from day. Where he had been solemn and observant, she was bright and boisterous from the start. She cried loudly, laughed even louder, and seemed determined to explore every inch of the world within her reach. "She has your spirit," Yates told Wilhelmina one evening as they watched 3-year-old Will carefully try to teach his baby sister to stack blocks. "That determination to experience everything on her own terms." "And Will has your patience," Wilhelmina replied, smiling as their son gently guided Margaret's chubby hands. "That quiet strength and understanding." Life continued to move forward. The ranch grew steadily, with Yates developing a reputation throughout Oklahoma Territory for breeding exceptional horses. The stores continued to prosper under Wilhelmina's management, even as she balanced motherhood with her business responsibilities. Gerald aged gracefully, spending more time with his grandchildren and less time worrying about business. He hired additional help for the stores, trusting Wilhelmina and Yates to make the important decisions while he enjoyed his retirement. When Will was 5 and Margaret was 2, Wilhelmina discovered she was pregnant for a third time. This pregnancy was unexpected but not unwelcome, and their third child, a boy they named James Yates Crawford, was born in October of 1899, just as the new century approached. James was a perfect blend of his siblings, with Will's thoughtful nature and Margaret's enthusiasm for life. He completed their family in a way that felt right, and though Wilhelmina and Yates agreed that 3 children were enough, they treasured each one. The turn of the century brought changes to Oklahoma Territory. There was talk of statehood, of progress and modernization. Enid grew larger, more established. New families moved in, new businesses opened. The Crawford stores adapted to the changing times and the ranch continued to thrive. In 1902, Gerald Louise passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 72. He had lived to see his daughter happily married, had known his 3 grandchildren, and had watched the business he had built grow beyond anything he had imagined. His death was a tremendous loss for Wilhelmina, but she took comfort in knowing he had lived a full life and had died content. They buried him next to Wilhelmina's mother in the Enid Cemetery, and at his funeral, the church was packed with people whose lives he had touched over the years. Wilhelmina stood between Yates and her children, accepting condolences, and she thought about how her father had never given up hope for her. He had believed that the right man would find his way to Enid, and he had been proven right. After her father's death, Wilhelmina threw herself into managing the stores and helping Yates with the ranch. The children grew, healthy and happy. Will showed an early interest in horses, following his father around the ranch and learning everything he could about breeding and training. Margaret was drawn to the business side of things, asking endless questions about inventory and pricing and negotiation. James, the youngest, seemed to love everything equally, happy whether he was helping with horses or working in the store. By 1905, the Crawford Ranch was one of the most respected horse breeding operations in Oklahoma Territory. Buyers came from across the region to purchase their horses, and Yates had hired several ranch hands to help with the growing operation. The stores continued to prosper, and Wilhelmina had opened a third location in yet another town. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching their children play in the yard, Yates took Wilhelmina's hand. "You remember what you said to me when we first met?" he asked. "When I asked what you wanted out of life, I said I wanted to matter," Wilhelmina recalled. "I wanted to do something that made a difference, even if it was just a small difference. I wanted to be seen for who I truly am, and I wanted to love someone who loved me back with equal measure." "Do you feel like you have those things now?" Yates asked gently. Wilhelmina looked at him, at this man who had ridden into Enid 12 years ago just for the chance to meet her. She looked at their children, playing and laughing in the golden evening light. She thought about the businesses they had built, the lives they had touched, the family they had created together. "I have so much more than I ever dreamed possible," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You gave me all of that, Yates. You saw me when no one else did, and you loved me for exactly who I was. You gave me everything too," Yates said, bringing her hand to his lips. "You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. You made me want to be the best version of myself. I would ride 1,000 miles just for the chance to meet you all over again." Wilhelmina leaned into him, and they sat together in comfortable silence, watching their children as the sun set over the Oklahoma prairie. This was what happiness looked like, she thought. Not the absence of challenges or difficulties, but the presence of love and partnership and shared dreams. Over the years that followed, the Crawford family continued to thrive. Oklahoma Territory became the state of Oklahoma in 1907, and Enid grew from a small frontier town into a proper city. The Crawford stores became institutions, known for fair prices and quality goods. The ranch expanded to include over 500 acres, with dozens of horses and a reputation that extended far beyond Oklahoma's borders. Will grew into a tall, serious young man who took over more and more of the ranch operations as he got older. Margaret developed a head for business that rivaled her mother's, eventually taking primary responsibility for the stores. James, the youngest, proved to be a talented mediator between his siblings, able to see both sides of any argument and find common ground. Wilhelmina and Yates watched their children grow with pride and joy. They celebrated milestones, weathered difficulties, and continued to build their life together. Their love, which had begun with a cowboy riding into town based on nothing but a story and a feeling, had grown into something deep and abiding, the kind of partnership that sustained them through everything life brought. In 1915, when Will was 21, he married a kind young woman named Sarah who shared his love of horses. The wedding was held at the ranch, and as Wilhelmina watched her eldest son exchange vows, she thought about her own wedding day all those years ago. She caught Yates's eye across the crowd, and he smiled at her, the same slow smile that had captured her heart the first time she saw it. Margaret married 2 years later, choosing a thoughtful school teacher named Robert who appreciated her business acumen and never tried to diminish her ambitions. Their wedding was a grand affair in Enid's largest church, and Wilhelmina cried happy tears throughout the ceremony. James took his time finding the right person, but when he was 25, he met a young woman named Elizabeth who had just moved to Enid to work as a nurse. She was compassionate and strong, and she and James were clearly meant for each other. Their wedding was simple but beautiful, held in the garden of the ranch house. As Wilhelmina and Yates's children married and started families of their own, the ranch and the stores were passed down gradually. Will took over the ranch completely, running it with the same dedication his father had shown. Margaret managed the stores with innovation and skill, expanding even further than Wilhelmina had. James split his time between helping both his siblings, the natural bridge between the two family enterprises. Wilhelmina and Yates, now in their 50s, began to step back from the day-to-day operations, though they remained active advisors and doting grandparents to their growing number of grandchildren. They spent their time traveling, visiting places they had always wanted to see, and simply enjoying each other's company. One evening in 1920, as they sat on the porch of the ranch house where they had raised their family, Yates turned to Wilhelmina with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about how different your life would have been if I had not heard Jake Matthews talking in that saloon?" he asked. Wilhelmina considered the question. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted, "but I also believe that we would have found each other somehow. Maybe not the way we did, but I think we were meant to be together." "I like to think so too," Yates said, taking her hand as he had so many times over the years. "I like to think that somewhere, in some way, we would have found each other, because a love like ours does not come from circumstance. It comes from recognition, from two people seeing each other clearly and choosing each other completely." "We did choose each other," Wilhelmina agreed. "And we kept choosing each other every single day. That is what made it work." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the land they had built together. In the distance, they could hear their grandchildren playing, could see lights coming on in the houses Will and Margaret had built on the ranch property. The family they had created extended all around them, a living legacy of the love they had found in each other. As the years continued to pass, Wilhelmina and Yates grew old together gracefully. They celebrated 50 years of marriage in 1943, surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. The party was held at the ranch, and people came from all over Oklahoma to celebrate the couple who had built such an extraordinary life together. At the celebration, Will stood up to make a toast. He looked at his parents, both of them in their 70s now but still holding hands, still looking at each other with the same love they had shown from the beginning. "When I was a boy," Will said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd, "I asked my father what the secret to a happy marriage was. He told me it was simple. Find someone who sees you clearly, who loves you for exactly who you are, and then spend every day choosing to see and love them in return. My parents have done that for 50 years, and they have shown all of us what real love looks like." To Yates and Wilhelmina Crawford, may we all be so lucky as to find what they have. The crowd raised their glasses, and Wilhelmina looked around at all the faces she loved, all the lives that had sprung from her and Yates's decision to take a chance on each other. She thought about the woman she had been at 23, standing at the window of her father's store, certain she would never find love. She thought about the cowboy who had ridden into town from another county, just for the chance to meet her. She thought about everything they had built together, all the joy and sorrow and ordinary moments that had made up their life. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that she would not change a single thing. Every rejection, every lonely night, every moment of doubt had led her to this, to Yates, to the family they had created, to the love that had sustained them through everything. Yates squeezed her hand, and she turned to look at him. His hair was white now, his face lined with age, but his eyes were still the same clear gray that had captured her attention all those years ago. And when he smiled at her, that slow, transforming smile, she felt the same flutter in her chest that she had felt the first time. "I love you," she said, loud enough for only him to hear over the celebration around them. "I love you too," Yates replied. "Today, tomorrow, and for whatever time we have left. Always and forever, Wilhelmina Crawford." They lived for many more years, watching their family continue to grow and prosper. The Crawford stores became a small chain throughout Oklahoma, respected for their integrity and quality. The ranch remained one of the finest horse breeding operations in the state, known throughout the region. Yates passed away peacefully in 1952 at the age of 85, surrounded by his family, his hand held firmly in Wilhelmina's. His last words were to her, a simple thank you for everything, that made her cry even as she smiled. Wilhelmina lived 3 more years without him, years that were both lonely and full. She was surrounded by the family they had built, loved fiercely by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But she missed Yates every single day, missed his smile and his steady presence, and the way he had always seen her so clearly. When she passed away in her sleep in 1955 at the age of 85, her children found a letter she had written, addressed to all of them. In it, she told them the story of how she had been rejected by every suitor in town, how she had almost given up hope of finding love, and how a cowboy had ridden in from another county just for her. She wrote about the importance of knowing your own worth, of refusing to settle for less than you deserve, of taking chances on love even when it seems impossible. She wrote about the life she and Yates had built together, how every moment of joy and every challenge overcome had strengthened their bond. And she ended with a plea for her descendants to remember that real love, the kind that lasts a lifetime, is built on respect and partnership, and the daily choice to see and cherish each other. They buried her next to Yates in the Enid Cemetery, not far from where her parents lay. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, all of them touched in some way by the lives of Yates and Wilhelmina Crawford. And as their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren stood around the grave, they knew they were saying goodbye not just to 2 people, but to a love story that would be told in their family for generations to come. The Crawford stores continued to operate for many more years, eventually being sold but maintaining the family name in honor of Wilhelmina's vision. The ranch stayed in the family, passed down through Will's line, still breeding exceptional horses over 70 years after Yates had purchased that first parcel of land. But more than the businesses or the property, what lasted was the example Yates and Wilhelmina had set. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren all grew up hearing the story of how they had found each other, how they had chosen each other against all odds and built something extraordinary together. And in their own lives, in their own relationships, they tried to live up to that example, to find that same kind of deep, abiding love that had sustained Yates and Wilhelmina through more than 50 years together. The story of the woman who had been rejected by every suitor in town and the cowboy who rode in from another county just for her became a legend in Enid, Oklahoma. It was told in schools and written about in local histories. It was held up as an example of true love, of the importance of knowing your worth and waiting for someone who sees you clearly. And whenever someone asked what made their love so special, what made it last when so many other marriages failed, the answer was always the same. They chose each other not out of convenience or obligation, not because they had no other options or because society expected it of them. They chose each other because they recognized something essential in one another, because they saw past the surface to the heart beneath. And having made that choice, they honored it every single day, through joy and sorrow, through triumph and struggle for the rest of their lives. That was the legacy of Yates and Wilhelmina Crawford. Not just the businesses they built or the family they raised, but the proof that real love exists, that it is worth waiting for, and that when you find it, it can transform everything. Their story lived on long after they were gone, a testament to the power of seeing and being seen, of choosing and being chosen, of loving and being loved in return with equal measure and unwavering devotion. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Not the rejections or the doubts, not the obstacles or the skeptics, but the love they had found in each other and the life they had built together. It was a love story for the ages, born in the Wild West of Oklahoma Territory, sustained through decades of change and challenge, and remembered long after the last chapter had been written. It was the story of Wilhelmina Louise, who knew her worth and refused to settle, and Yates Crawford, who rode in from another county just for the chance to meet her. And it was proof that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin with the simplest choice: to take a chance on each other and see where it leads.